The third mission of the first parak of Pirkei Avos. Antignos Isocho Kibil Mishim Natzadik. Antignos Isocho, from the man of Socho, he came from a location called Socho. He received the transmission from Shimon Atzadik, Hoy Omer. Al tiu kavodim memshamshin sarav almanas kabel pras. You should not be servants or subjects who serve the master for the sake of reward. Meaning, when the master gives you a dictate and you adhere to his dictate, it should not be for the sake of your own self-interest, for the sake of reward. You're serving the master not for the sake of reward, but for the sake of the master. Let's understand just the concept. We speak about there's a mitzvah to fear God, but fear manifests itself in one of two ways: either fear of punishment, since he's the master. If he gives you a directive, and if you don't follow it, there's going to be a consequence. Whether it's illness, dying, financial loss, whatever it is, some level of trauma, which compromises your life. And the person understands that because he's the master, you better adhere to his directive, because otherwise there's going to be a very severe consequence. So why are you really addressing the directive of your master? Because you're afraid what the master may do to you. So that's really self-interest. That's self-interest. Or if you do it, it's because you'll be rewarded exceptionally in a very generous way. The reward is so phenomenal, you can't even be compensated in this world. That's a terrific deal. Do you have such an opportunity? That's almanas l'kabel pras. So what is the motivating factor? What's the incentive? What's the impetus? Yourself. Yourself, not God. It's not God's dictate for God, but you're doing it for yourself, self-interest. But if you do it because you recognize, as we said, fear could also mean reverence. What does it mean, reverence? You revere the master. It's because you understand who the master is, just serving the master, even without reward. That itself, that privilege itself, without even reward, you're dedicated to do the will of your master because you revere him to such a degree, or because you love him to such a degree. That's why you're doing it. So what's the motivating factor? Not yourself. The motivating factor is the one who gave the directive, which is God himself. So therefore, he says, when you serve the master, you should not serve him for the sake of reward. That should not be the reason. Because if it's for the sake of reward, it's for you, it's not for him. And if somehow you could work it out that you could reconcile to wiggle your way out of it, you'd want to wiggle your way out of it. But if you're doing it for the sake of the master, because of your reverence for him or your love for him, you don't want to be excused from this. It's something that if you see that as the opportunity because you're serving the master. And that gives you a value. Your value is serving him. It's not you for you, it's you for him. That's the difference when you serve the master for the master or you serve the master for yourself. What's the difference in the reality, qualitatively speaking? I'm not even speaking about position-wise. The human being is finite. We're physical. So if the emphasis is you, who are you? You're all about limitation. God is infinite. So when you serve, the impetus, and God is only the means to the end, and the end is you. So the reward manifests itself in you. As you're finite, the result of your action is also finite. But when you serve God, who's infinite, for the sake of God, so that action, what's its persona? What persona does it take on? This is a godly act. Once it's godly, it's for the sake of the master. There's no limit to that. and therefore it's limitless. It's a whole different dimension of what? Of reality. Because it's for the master, not for the person himself. That's just the basic difference between for the sake of the subject or for the sake of the master. Let's understand. But factually, if you do serve God for your own sake, you're rewarded. Now the question is, let's say you're a slave of a master, and he says to this master, the truth is, I wouldn't listen to you because I don't value you. But the only reason why I'm going to listen, because I have no choice, because you're going to beat me to a pulp. I mean, that taking on that position is a level of defiance. It's a level of disrespect. It's the ultimate disrespect. If I could get away without listening to you, I would reject you and I would escape from you. So is that a dedicated servant? It's a rebellious servant. So if that's the case, even when you do something not for the sake of the master, you shouldn't be rewarded, but you should be reprimanded. You should be punished. But yet we say that even if you do a mitzvah shlo lishma, you do it with an ulterior motive, you're handsomely rewarded. The question is why? You should be punished. The allegory I always give is a person was a dedicated employee, worked for a company for 50 years, never missed a day in 50 years, always came on time, stayed as long as he had to stay, never even took off sick days, ever, 50 years. Now, after 50 years, the owner of the company is selling the company to a third party. And he's selling the company with his dedicated employee. So he introduces his dedicated employee to the new owner. He says, see this man for the past 50 years, he's been dedicated to us, never missed a day, never came a minute late, never left a minute before times. And he's dedicated like you don't believe how dedicated he is. So all of a sudden he opens his mouth and he says, the truth is, if somebody would have given me an offer, $1 more, I'd be out of here immediately. The only reason why I'm here is for me, because this was my security blanket. I had nowhere else that security blanket. I couldn't care less about this company. All I'm interested is myself. When the owner of the company hears this, he's appalled. He's taken aback. Whoever heard such a thing? All along, you deceived me. Even though the end product was the same, but here I thought you were dedicated selflessly to the company, and here I hear it's only you, it's not me. So if God knows our intentions, that it's the person, not God, where he actually wills your existence and everything you are, he gives you even more so, that's a position to take. It's me and not you. It's for my sake. It's only because of the ulterior motive. You deserve to be punished, reprimanded, punished, but yet you receive reward. Why?
I hear you. I hear you, Rabbi.
What would you say? Now, the Gemara tells us in 2 locations, Rava says it, 3 locations, that there's a concept, mitoch shelo lishma b'lishma, that even when you do something with ulterior motive, ultimately it has a potential that can bring you to the right mindset, to do it for the right reason. Nobody's born a tzaddik. And even when we do something, even the parent raises a child, parent gives incentives to the child. So why does the child do it? Because the child has an appreciation for what he's doing? No, child has no understanding the value of what he's doing. But the parent gives incentives at every level of his development to incentivize the child to do the right thing. Ultimately, when the child becomes intelligent enough and understands the value, then he does it because of the value of what he's doing. But until that point, the child does it only because of the incentive that the parent gives the child. We're born into this world. We're physical beings. Our inclinations are totally controlled and dictated by our physicality. God doesn't expect more than that. Nobody's born with 100% absolute clarity, and therefore you do with the will of God and appreciate who God is. It's an orientation. It's a training process. But in that training process, God says there's something innate when you do a mitzvah, even ulterior motive, it has the ability to bring you over the top, to bring you to a point of appreciating its value and do it for the right reason. So why even the shelo lishma, although as I compare it to the other case, which the owner is appalled and upset, God is not, because God himself is in touch with the reality of who we are. And the only way we can get to the finish line, we have to start with incentives. We have to be incentivized. We do it with ulterior motives. But ultimately, because it has that ability to bring you to the right place, God says that even that has value. But you realize there's time to grow up. If you have the ability to do it for the sake of the master, or to do it with ulterior motive, you're shortchanging yourself. You're falling short of the mark. Initially, there's no problem, because ultimately it has that ability to bring you there. Where do we learn out? Where do we see in the Torah that even when you do something not for the right reason, you're rewarded? We learned from Bullock. Bullock built altars and brought sacrifices. So Bilam advised them to be able to curse the Jewish people, because you're getting God's attention. So Bullock, he was a pagan Bullock, but he brought the sacrifices to God, because he brought, even though there was an ulterior motive, so he should be able to curse the Jews. But because he did that, he merited to have Rus, the Moabite. The grandmother of King David was his descendant. He merited to have such a special descendant because he brought those sacrifices to God. But he did it not for the right reason. It was with a negative intent, ultimately to destroy the Jewish people. But nevertheless, since he did the mitzvah of acknowledging God through sacrifices, he merited that. That's the source we learned this concept, that since even when you do an ulterior motive, since it has the ability to bring you over the top, therefore that has innate value. But if you want to do it correct or not correct, he advises you, you should serve the master not for the sake of reward. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. The same action, if you do it and understand what the value of that action is, and you understand who you're serving, its innate value increases in multiples, not even to be compared when you do it with the ulterior motive. The question which is asked, the Gemara tells us in one location that if a man gives charity, his son is deathly ill, and he gives charity, so his son should recover. I'm giving this charity so my son should be able to live. Well, let's say he's well, but he should merit protection. In the merit of giving the charity, his son should be able to live. So the Gemara tells us, cites a source, Harezet Tzaddik Gomer. The person who gives the charity with this intent, he's considered an absolute tzaddik. So he asks, the commentator on the page asks, how do we reconcile with the Mishnah? It says you should serve the master for the sake of the master, not for the sake of reward. And over there, he's only giving the charity, only so his son should be able to live. And it classifies him as a tzaddik gomer, as an absolute tzaddik. That's Tosa's question. That's the commentator on the page. So Tosa's answers that if a person does something with an ulterior motive, I'm doing it only because. What happens if it doesn't evolve as he wanted it to evolve? Let's say, God forbid, the child dies and doesn't live, and he regrets that he gave the charity. That's what the Mishnah is speaking about. We're not talking about the impetus. The impetus could be with the self-interest. But if ultimately you're not going to regret the mitzvah, the action, even if it doesn't turn out the way you turned out, and you're satisfied doing the mitzvah, then that's okay. We're not saying it's the ultimate, but it's okay, because basically I'm doing it for the sake of God. But if you regret, if it doesn't work out the way you wanted it to work out, you regret that you even did it. It's like a person makes an investment because he thought it would bring in profit. Turns out it was a disaster. He says, if I would have known, I would have never put the money in this investment. If a person says, he would have known that his child wouldn't live, or whatever, for whatever reason, it wouldn't happen, I wouldn't have done it. That's shlo lishma. You should not do it with that intent. But since over here he does not have that level of remorse, and he says it's okay to give it just for the sake of the master, that's considered doing the mitzvah for the sake of the master. That's Tosas' answer in Psachim. That's where Tosas is. Other commentators explain it this way. The Gemara tells us that if you learn Pirkei Avos, Pirkei Yosef is called Chasidus. Tzaddik means you do everything correctly. Chosid means you do something, you're scrupulously pious, you go beyond the call of duty. Although you have no obligation, but you go beyond what your obligation is. That's a chosid. Pirkei Avos is mila de chasidusa. If you want to be a chosid, this is the way you have to be done. Tzaddik is fine. Even if you give for the sake of, with your ulterior motive, you're a tzaddik, because factually you gave charity, you did the mitzvah, you did everything. However, if you want to be a chosid, you want to be at that more advanced level, there should be no ulterior motive whatsoever. It should be purely for the sake of what? For the sake of the master. That's what other commentators explain. However, there's Mesillas Yesharim, Rabbi Lutzato, in his work of Path of the Just writes, we know that a person does mitzvahs for many reasons. A person does a mitzvah because he wants to have a share in the world to come, which that's what it's all about. This world is a proving ground, and we're put to the test. And if we succeed, we get a share in the world to come. That's what it's all about. And that's what we were endowed with, the ability to make choices, either do or don't do. So let's say a person puts on tefillin, eats matzah, observes Shabbos, because he wants to have a share in the world to come. And he does it better because he wants to have a greater share in the world to come. Is that correct? Is that called lishma? Is that called doing for the sake of the mitzvah? She says, definitely it's called. Why? Because that's exactly why God wants you to do it, for that reason. You could have gone south, you went north. Why do you go north? Because God wants you to go north. Why? Because God wants you to be able to ultimately arrive at that destination. He says that's called lishma. That's doing for the sake of the master. That's the will of the master. He says, however, it's not the ultimate level. The ultimate level is called Yiras Haromus. You're doing it because you revere God. It has nothing to do with you having a share in the world to come. Appreciating who God is, it's a privilege to be able to serve the master for the master. That itself is the greatest reward. I'll give you an example. Person is chosen to be a cabinet minister. Member of the cabinet. Originally he headed a corporation, and he has to quit his job when he was earning $10 million a year, and he becomes part of the cabinet, of the president's cabinet, the king's cabinet. It doesn't make a difference. He's willing to take a cut in salary, almost to nothing, just to serve his country, or to serve his king, or to serve the president, whatever it is. Why are you giving it all up? You could say, well, that's what honor's worth. He's doing it for himself. But let's say a person is a true patriot, because he feels the service he could offer to the country, nobody could offer that service. And that's why he's doing it. A person chooses to be a doctor rather than go into finance, although he's not going to make the amount of money when he goes into medicine, what he's going to make in finance, and he had the opportunity, had the capacity. Why? Because he wants to serve humanity. By being a doctor who'll come to discoveries, he'll be able to serve humanity. That's why he's doing it. So why is he doing it? Of course, he's going to be paid, but that's not what it's about. Because if it would be the pay issue, he would have gone into finance. It's the same idea. When you do it purely without any ulterior motive, even if it's a respectable ulterior motive, world to come, God wants you to have share in the world to come, but still you fall short of where you should be at. Because if you really understand who God is, you wouldn't even need that incentive. Understanding, serving God himself, who's the master, who's the creator, that's the ultimate privilege, and that you don't need more than that. That is the greatest level of payment. Okay? That's the Mesillas Yesharim.
Rabbi, historically,
1 second. I'm convinced the two obligations a child has to a parent. There's an obligation to honor one's parent, mother and father, and there's an obligation to revere your parent. What's the difference honoring and revering? Honoring means if your parent needs some level of assistance to stand, to get dressed, to be given food, to be accommodated, that's honoring a parent. Revering a parent is you don't sit in your parents' seat. Where they sit, you don't sit there. When they speak, you don't interrupt their conversation. You don't openly disagree with them only in the most respectful way. Why? Because since your parent is held at the greatest level of esteem, it's a disrespect or to call your parent by his first name. It's a disrespect. But you call who knows somebody else by his first name. No, you're obligated to revere your parent because your parent has that special status. Therefore, you speak to your parent and interact on the most respectful level. That's reverence. Because if you understand who your parent is, that's the way you must maintain that level of relationship. So within the structure of family, the way God set the structure, the parent is the matriarch and the patriarch, and the children are less than that. And they go and they have to revere and esteem the patriarchal figures in a certain way. He says, why? Because if you take a look in the Torah, it says, when it speaks about reverence, Ish imov aviv tiro, a person has an obligation to revere his mother and father, es shapsosei tishmoru, and you must keep my Shabbos and the Hashem. So Rameir Simcha Vinsk says, if somebody comes off the street and tells you something, by the way, this is what you should do, and he doesn't have any special status, you don't revere him. Just because you say so, why should I listen? But if the nature of the dynamic, the family dynamic is the parent is the ultimate, and when the parent says something, you see the parent as the sage wisdom, and it's only because the parent is who he is, that's what he's telling the child embraces that. So we embed within the family profile structure is this nature of relationship. There's a hierarchy, there's parents and their children. And this guarantees that the Masorah, that the transmission is continuous. When the parent says, this is the Masorah, one of the problems with Rabbi Wine, he has a history tape series. Years ago, we had it, the Yad Avram. And he writes over there, when the Jews came from Europe in the earlier part of the 20th century, then the 19th century, so they came, what were they? They weren't educated, secularly speaking. Yeah, a tailor, a housekeeper, the woman did wash, whatever she did. And they were dedicated to their children, that they wanted their children to make something of themselves. Financially, they should be financially secure. So what did the parent do? Parent worked day and night to be able to put their son through college, to become a lawyer, to become a doctor, to become an accountant. Now the son, because there was a lack of Jewish education, the child became secularized. So the parent, they loved their parents. There wasn't anything they wouldn't do for their parents because they realized the parents sacrificed to give them this education. But when they got involved in any intellectual discussion, they would sit at the Seder and this parent would speak as sage wisdom. Did he look at the parent as sage wisdom? They're in their own world. They're from the old world. We're in the new world. We understand, but of course, we'll treat them with the greatest level of respect. But did they give any value to the position of the parent if the parent was an observant Jew? Of course not. They're provincial Jews. They're backward. They're archaic. It has no relevance. But they love their parents. They'll do anything for them because if not for the parent, they understand they wouldn't be where they are. But at one time, the parent wasn't only, I love you, I revere you. You understand things I don't understand because you're the parent. That's embedded in the family profile. That's the dynamic. And therefore, the parent himself, when he says something, this is the Masorah of Sinai. It's not, you tell me fables. It's not fables. It's not folklore. This is the real thing. And I respect it. Regardless, I may be the lawyer, the doctor, or the financier. It doesn't make a difference. But my parent has a representation. And because he has that representation, therefore, that guarantees the Masorah continues from generation to generation until the end of time for that reason. Towards the end of the Sefer Dvorim, the book of Dvorim, there's a portion called Shoftim V'Shotrim Titim Chol Sharecha, that every community has to have judges, a court of 23, which is called a Sanhedrin Kitano, and these judges aren't ordinary judges. They have to be ordained from Moshe Rabbeinu. They have that special ordination, plus they're proficient in all aspects of Torah, plus much more. In addition, each community has to have law enforcers. That when the court gives a verdict, what's going to guarantee that the people are going to accept the verdict? So you have law enforcers, they enforce the law. Because without law enforcers, the court, you could have a law on the books, it means nothing. So the law enforcers, they enforce the law, the verdict of the court, the legislations of the court. Now, it says every community has to have this type of court with law enforcers. There's an argument in the Mishnah, what's considered a community that has to have this kind of court. One opinion is if you have 120 Jews living in a community, that community requires this judicial system and law enforcers. In other words, says no, it's 240, but relatively speaking, a very small town, basically a village. So I asked the question, why was man endowed with free choice? To be a beneficiary of his actions. It's up to me to choose how to live, to do right or do wrong. And therefore, if I choose to do right, it's attributed to me because I chose to do right. And if chas v'shalom, God forbid, I choose to do wrong, you're held accountable for doing wrong because you only did wrong because you chose to do wrong. What about if I go and tell a person, I take a gun, put it to his temple. I said, you make one wrong move, I pulled the trigger. Does that have any relevance to free choice? If you value your life, you're not making a wrong move. Basically, if every town, even a town as small as 120 Jews, or even 240 Jews, has a court of 123 judges with a special ordination where they could give verdicts of the death penalty, lashes, corporal punishment, besides financial penalties and everything under the sun. And it's guaranteed to be enforced because they have law enforcement. They have law enforcers. You tell me, these people there, what's the value of their choice? They have no choice but to do the right thing. Because they have a court that could implement the law immediately, and it can be brought into reality with the law enforcers. Here, God gives us free choice, and God takes away our free choice by creating this infrastructure. In every Jewish community, a Jew doesn't have much choice. You better put on tefillin. They find out you don't put on tefillin, they'll beat you to death. You don't eat matzah, you don't build the sukkah, you're gonna hear the music. You don't do this, you don't observe Shabbos, you could be put to death. If that's the case, what's been left to us in terms of free choice? God's putting a gun to our temple and says you make the wrong move, it's over. But yet, it's a positive commandment that every community must have this kind of infrastructure. A court, 23 plus law enforcers. Question I asked in the past. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, upcoming parsha, you're God's children. A person has a child, and the world is out of control. So the son says to his father, if the world's out of control, why can't I be out of control? They're getting away with murder, these people, in terms of the behavior being unacceptable. So the father says to the son, because you're my son, it's okay for them, but not for my son. There's a negative commandment, you're not permitted to commit murder. You're not permitted to eat non-kosher food. You want something? That's not within your realm of choice. For my son, being a prince, your choice has to be, when you do the right thing, what is your intention? Do you do it for the sake of reward, or do you do it for the sake of the master? Do you do it shlo lishma, with an ulterior motive, or you do it for the sake of God? That's the choice. So we're talking about the choice of a Jew is based on a qualitative level. It's not doing the wrong thing. You're held accountable. If you could have done it more right, why didn't you do more right? But to be a murderer, to be an adulterer, to be a thief, to be a damager, that's unacceptable. To live like an irresponsible Jew, That's not for the prince, that's for the commoners. That's their choice, not for the Jewish people. Therefore, so what's going to guarantee that the Jew doesn't fall to the level of the commoner? By having this kind of infrastructure in every community, the special level of this court, 23 judges that are ordained by Moshe, could rule on death penalty, death, corporal punishment, everything under the sun. If that's the case with law enforcers, nobody is going in that direction. Nobody's going out the door. Well, I'm a free man. You're not a free man. If you're a prince, you have to maintain a certain minimal mode of behavior. The other behavior, that's for the commoners. That's not for the prince. Therefore, that's what we're saying now. Putting on tefillin, of course you have to put on tefillin. Charity, you have to give charity. Everything. But what should your mindset be? Is it for the sake of reward with the ulterior motive, or it's for the sake of the master? Because you appreciate who you're serving. And that will determine qualitatively what the value of that action is. What's the nature of the relationship? Rav Chaim Volozhin explains something with an allegory. There was this prince. He was, as a child, he had friends. And so when he was a child, the father allowed him to play with the other kids, and they played in the mud. And they were boisterous, and it was okay as a little child. But as the prince matured, he started to be mentored and trained how he has to behave as a prince. And the behavior of the children that he grew up with, that's not for him, because they're a different classification of society. But the prince always was interested in having that less controlled behavior. So here the prince is wearing his regal garments, and he sees his friends playing in the mud. With his regal garments, he jumps into the mud, and he soils everything. What does he look like? Totally. If you're a prince with your regal garments, you go into the mud. The soul of a Jew is a different dimension of soul. We're regal. The soul of a non-Jew and a Jew are two different souls. We have a regal soul. And that's where we have all these positive, negative commandments which a non-Jew is not bound to. Because his soul is an ordinary soul, not a regal soul. We have a soul because of what took place at Sinai, that we could cleave directly to God. They can't. They're so-called outsiders. We're insiders. As a result of that, what's expected of us is not what's expected of them. Just had this week's reading. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you Jews, you're too much for me to deal with. And he cites the Midrash, King Solomon, the wise man ever lived. He says, so the question is, the wisest man who ever lived, you mean he can't adjudicate a case? Or Moshe Rabbeinu who split the sea, who brought the manna, who this and that. The Jews are too difficult for him? He says, no. Because the Jews themselves are who they are. Therefore, the responsibility of the leadership, it's a different level of responsibility. If they fail as leaders, they're culpable. A non-Jewish judge, since there's not much expected of society, they don't carry the world. So even if they fail and they do things which are corrupted, it doesn't off-balance the world. But the Jewish people, that they are the center of the universe, if the leaders don't maintain them as they should, the level of culpability is something beyond our understanding of how serious that level of liability is. Therefore, they said, we have to maintain you differently. We have to be more cautious. Therefore, we need assistance to be able to adjudicate the cases. We have more advanced courts, less advanced courts, different levels within the judicial system for that reason. But it's again, it goes back to who we are, what we represent, what God tolerates, what he wouldn't tolerate because of who we are. You know something, democracy is a phenomenal thing. What's the difference between a monarchy and democracy? Monarchy means the whole mindset of society is There's a master, you people are subjects. And everything you have, you understand, is only through the beneficence of the king. And in a moment, he could end your life. That's the mindset, that's the reality of your existence. There's no such thing as questioning the king. You may question him in private, but push comes to shove. You better carry out whatever the king wants, because otherwise he could take your life. So there's never a consideration, I'll do what I want. Democracy is a whole different concept, different mindset. The orientation is, I have a say, I have what to do, I could say. You know, it's ruled by the masses. We are the masters. The moment, even if you're an observant Jew, but if you're brought up in a world where it's a democracy, this concept of I have a say, I have entitlement, I am entitled, that resonates. We have continuous whisperings in our ears. So it's really a contradictory concept. Judaism is God is the monarch. He dictates. We have no choice. Our choice is only do the will of God. Democracy says no. As long as you don't undermine society and break the law, you can do whatever you want, and you have entitlement, and you have a say. So we have two systems working in tandem, and somehow they're contradictory. You have to somehow put each one in perspective. One thing can't cross lines with the other. As much as we appreciate democracy, we have freedom, but simultaneously, when it comes to our relation with God, the free person is, you understand the value of that. That's your choice, to come to a level of understanding, appreciate what actually he offered us and what he gave us.